So tonight's speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Erica Canela, who is, originally from the other side of the pond from the United States, but has been living here for the last 19 years and is a self-described public historian who's been recently researching on the story of the Quakers in the 1640s and the 1650s and has a new book coming soon, which we've been chatting about and which I'm hugely looking forward to. Erica enjoys bringing to life the stories of the past to make them accessible to a wide audience. As anybody will know who's been following her social media recently, helping promote these talks by doing her own little bits and pieces about some of the Quaker characters involved, particularly James Naylor. So it's great to have a speaker who's doing their own little videos to promote their own talk, which has been great. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her this evening, and looking forward to hearing about the story of this remarkable and strange little religious group that appears in this period, which of course is actually one of those many sort of religious sects that had actually sort of emerged in the 1640s and 1650s, and yet this one still survives, of course, today. So Erica, thank you so much for coming in and agreeing to do this for us tonight. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be awkward and hope that sharing my screen the first time works. So
Absolutely.
it's always nerve-wracking, right? Okay. Feels good.
Yeah.
Feels good to me. Are we
Yeah.
good? Yes. Love that. Anyway, thank you. Thank you so much, Stuart, for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, especially for those of you who are in the UK who are here this evening, because it's one of those really rare, quite beautiful evenings. And so I appreciate you being here and not sort of just waiting for the recorded version of this talk. So without further ado, so this is a this is a complex story about a complex period of history. The 1650s remain my favorite decade. It's the very definition of adaptation, trial and error, confusion, a bit of fear, and a lot of change. And that's all before we throw religion into the mix. So this evening, we're looking at Oliver Cromwell and the Quakers. And I subtitled this talk A Delicate Balance because I think it's the phrase that best describes the years from 1652 to 1658. It's such a short span of time we're looking at this evening. But my goodness, it was an important few years. As a public historian, normally when I give talks, I spend a lot of time on the Civil Wars. Many early Quaker converts began their journey of religious descent on the battlefields. The Civil Wars would not only shape political futures, but they would also fundamentally change the social, cultural, and religious landscape during much of the 1640s and 1650s. The wars created an environment in which new ideas like Quakerism could thrive. When talking about the Civil Wars, I look at the impact of trauma and how it essentially created a surprisingly willing and engaged audience for the earliest traveling Quaker ministers. But I'm not doing that tonight because we have an important question to answer. So we need to situate ourselves into the mid 1650s, when Quakerism really started to lay some roots. So, were the Quakers really a threat to social and political stability in the 1650s? You can write your answers on a card and you can review these again in probably about 37 minutes. So have a think, write them down. We'll come back. So at the onset, the Quakers tapped into the dissatisfaction and uncertainty of the time and spread their message with zeal, prolific writing, and a gifted traveling ministry. But they were not alone. Other radical religious sects emerged in this period. Now, the list I'm about to give you is not exhaustive, And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about them, but they're absolutely worth mentioning at this stage. So I will. So seekers were pretty skeptical of all organized religion and believed churches and the clergy were not necessary and that God could speak to individuals directly. A lot of seekers would end up joining the Quakers in the 1650s. Baptists formed some of the earliest dissenting congregations in England. They were often associated with the New Model Army, serving as chaplains and soldiers. They believed that the true church was made of voluntary communities of the faithful, not state institutions. In the 1640s, two groups of Baptists emerged. General Baptists believed in free will and that Christ died for everyone, and particular Baptists believed in predestination and that Christ only died for the elect few. Levelers believed in popular sovereignty, equality for men before the law, and religious toleration. Diggers referred to themselves as true levelers and are widely known as proto-communists. They advocated for the abolition of private property and common ownership of land and resources. Fifth monarchists, this is a list. This is a list. So it's one of those things where this is probably a lecture in itself on just these groups, but we got to move on. We got to get to the Quakers. So fifth monarchists, they believed that Christ was returning real soon. They were politically aggressive and wanted to establish a theocratic government to prepare for the return of Jesus Christ. Ranters were just spiritual anarchists, really. They believed that those in touch with the divine were no longer bound by biblical or human laws. So they rejected sin and advocated for a bit of an everything goes situation, which was deeply unpopular. So, with all this choice, you can see that the desire for a new religious identity was growing. Quakerism was viewed by some as an attractive alternative to the state church. The Quaker message was packaged in a way that resonated in these war-torn communities. Quakers would eventually establish meetings in every English county. This was a tribute to the enthusiasm of the missionaries and to the organizational skill of the first Quakers. These widespread meetings demonstrated the efficacy of the message and acceptance by local groups, as well as the effectiveness of the leaders sent to propagate the Quaker message. There are a few key influential individuals setting the Quaker Foundation at the onset, but for the sake of this talk, I'm going to introduce you to George Fox, who, for all intents and purposes, was the founding father of Quakerism. And I'll introduce James Naylor a little later on. George Fox, this handsome guy here, he was born in the village of Drayton-in-the-Clay, which is now known as Fenny Drayton, in Leicestershire, in July 1624. At the age of 19, in 1643, Fox left his family and began a period of traveling. Bit of a, we could call it a gap year, possibly. He wrote that he was plagued by the temptations of sin and despair and found no solution in any of the religious options of the day. He felt most at home amongst the dissenting people, particularly the General Baptists, who I mentioned a little earlier. As he traveled, he remained within regions controlled by parliamentary forces. During the late 1640s, Fox had several significant religious experiences, and he regarded them as divine revelations. The experiences prompted his public ministry, which began in the Midlands and Yorkshire in 1647. During this period, Fox began his practice of entering churches to dispute with the clergy. Obviously, they loved that. And unsurprisingly, he was often attacked by mobs of local people when preaching. In 1650, he was imprisoned for blasphemy in Derby. He was offered a captaincy in the army in exchange for his freedom, but he declined, claiming he fought with spiritual weapons, not outward ones. Fox recruited important early Quaker preachers at the onset, and his mission to the north of England from 1651 to 1652 was overwhelmingly successful because his message was acceptable to pre-existing congregations of religious dissenters. like the seekers I had mentioned earlier. There was an early rejection of church hierarchy. Fox and the earliest converts preached that true worship did not require buildings, ostentatious ornaments, or ordained ministry. They refused to take oaths because they felt that by always speaking the truth, there was no need. And more importantly, in swearing an oath, they would disobey Christ, who said, "Swear not at all," in the book of Matthew. This tied into the belief that all were equal before God. Quakers observed that when oaths were required before local authorities and in courts, it demonstrated an inequality amongst men. Quakers also refused to remove their hats to social superiors, as was the custom in 17th century. The fact that George Fox is depicted here with a hat is not a coincidence. So refusing to remove their hats was another demonstration of social hierarchy that they wholeheartedly rejected. Quakers did not require a priest or other intermediary, as they had direct access to God and could also share in Christ's perfection. Their word for this experience was light. The idea of a light within each person was a radical notion that everyone had the freedom to communicate with God when and wherever they pleased. The freedom to choose also meant that it was part of a message that needed to be shared as widely as possible. Quakerism would not have survived without the foresight and capability to take the message further afield. The Quaker message may have appealed to those who felt excluded in the community or parish malcontents who were intrigued by the bold and confrontational style of the earliest Quakers, which obviously we're going to get into a bit later on. However, its viability as a religious community stemmed not only from the message being conveyed, but also the way it was introduced. Fox was a spark lighting the way, and people would abandon their leaders to follow new prophets like Fox, who provided a vision of an alternative, seemingly better future. Fox was aware of the demographics of his audience and was able to tailor his message accordingly. This targeted approach was not only intuitive and effective, but also quite shrewd. Fox was a mastermind of organizing and packaging this message in a way that made it irresistible to those looking for that alternative. Now, writing was not an inherent part of being a Quaker, but it certainly contributed to the movement's growth during the early 1650s, and it played an important practical role in the establishment of the Quaker ministry. It is estimated that about 100 Quaker authors had their writings published by 1656, contributing to a total of 291 pamphlets. Papers, letters, printed tracts could be more widely dispersed than oral preaching. And like preaching, the purpose of publishing was to convince potential followers by publicizing their cause to the outside world. And this is how many people in England would have first noticed Quakers, reading about them. In addition to printed materials, early Quakers were zealous and in many cases compelled to abandon their lives and completely uproot their lives to spread this message. Early Quakers wrote about traveling ministry and, to be honest, made it sound like it was a God-anointed privilege and gift. But is it really as straightforward as this? We need to talk about sacrifices. It's easy to be compelled by the message to become a traveling minister, but there are logistics to consider as well. Family, employment, risk. I mean, these are huge. The aims of these early Quaker missionaries was to establish meetings and offer spiritual leadership and particularly fellowship. Taking their early message to towns and villages, seeking out hospitable groups, and drawing widespread skepticism and hostility, the road is where the message evolved and developed. Quakers wrote about large meetings with eager audiences and ministers that convinced many to join. This was a carefully crafted narrative that unfurled from the leadership downward across the country. The hope was that the hope for traveling ministers was that converts would then carry on the message, set up communities, and then the movement would grow and multiply within that community and beyond. So that's kind of a very short intro to Quaker. So let's have a look at Oliver Cromwell at the time. So when we're looking at religion, Cromwell was a Puritan. He believed that individuals could establish direct contact with God through prayer and that congregations should choose their own ministers. And their principal duty was to inspire the people by preaching. He distrusted the Church of England hierarchy, but was never opposed to a state church. He was mostly committed to a wide measure of religious liberty. There was a state church under Cromwell, but there was no requirement to attend, and almost everyone, including Catholics and Jews, once they were readmitted to England in 1656, they're allowed to worship privately in the light of conscience. That light of conscience is freedom for groups and faiths to practice their beliefs undisturbed and without disturbing others. That's the key. Don't disturb others. This becomes an important caveat fairly quickly. As Lord Protector, he was tolerant of dissent within limits, but like any leader, was concerned about social order and political stability. He was notably more tolerant than most of his contemporaries. So this is a deeply simplified version of events happening. So we've got a stage of initial tolerance. Cromwell initially allowed Quakers to practice freely. Then there are growing tensions, and conflicts arose over Quakers' refusal to pay tithes and their disruptive behavior. Then we're going to have some regulatory actions. Cromwell had to impose some restrictions to manage their activities. But we're going to dig a little deeper with the time that we have remaining. So we've roughly established, like I said, what Quakers believed in, and that they were big fans of writing, and they very quickly established a powerful and persuasive traveling ministry. We know that Cromwell was tolerant, and Quakers would quickly, very swiftly overstep this grace. How? It was mostly their tendency to disrupt church services and their confrontational style of preaching. Their refusal to remove their hats proved a step too far for many in places of authority. And in many cases, it was their refusal to swear any oath that made it very easy for these annoyed judges to throw them into prisons. Quakers had natural opponents like Richard Baxter, the minister of St. Mary's Church in Kidderminster. Baxter was a prominent Puritan minister, theologian, and prolific writer. He was an easy target for the earliest Quakers in person and in print. Baxter saw the Quakers as a threat to social order and a contaminating influence on society. He wrote, "The worst of all is that they behave themselves like malignant enemies to the very cause and church and gospel and servants of Jesus Christ. Most of them that I have seen have an altered countenance, looking upon every man that they suspect to be a minister or a friend to the ministry with such detestation and hatred. Their very design, religion, and work is to make the people hate the ministers and revile them as they do." He wasn't alone. The diarist John Evelyn was even more pronounced in his judgments, writing in 1656 that the Quakers were a new fanatic set of dangerous principles. They do not show respect to any man, magistrate, or other, and seem a melancholy, proud sort of people. Richard Baxter said, "No man of reason should be a Quaker, considering that among those scraps of their religion which is made known, there is so much notorious falsehood and ungodliness. It was Baxter's belief that Quakers were unable to fully grasp the consequences of their actions against the church and ministry. It never seemed to have occurred to Quakers that congregations might find the disruption of their worship offensive, or that they might resent these strangers accusing their trusted minister of being a false teacher and being accused of living in Cain's nature in envy and malice. That's not what you go to church for on a Sunday. Certainly not. Quakers did not seem to get this. Local authorities, they responded quite fiercely, and you can understand why. The early Quakers seemed a bit hell-bent on destroying the peace. These people lived through the civil wars. They weren't interested in what they saw as fanatics disrupting this delicate balance. So yes, Quakers are frequently imprisoned. The first prominent court hearing involving Quakers in Worcestershire was the case of Humphrey Smith of Herefordshire and Thomas Cartwright from Bengeworth near Evesham. On Sunday, the 19th of August, 1655, George Hopkins, the vicar of Evesham All Saints, preached a sermon in Bengeworth against Quakerism, equating it with witchcraft. Unsurprisingly, a local Quaker meeting taking place in Cartwright's home was interrupted by Hopkins' congregation. However, the meeting continued, the crowd shortly scattered, but later that evening, Cartwright and Smith were requested to swear the oath of abjuration. If you refused this oath, you were judged to be a papist, and the penalty was confiscation of 2/3 of your goods and depletion of most of your civic rights. The authorities were not messing about. When offered the oath, Smith and Cartwright naturally refused and were arrested. They were taken to the house of a prominent magistrate, Samuel Gardner, examined and imprisoned the next day. Smith was not deterred as he shouted, "Repent and serve the living God," out of the prison windows. And in response, Justice Robert Martin was alleged to have encouraged the people assembled to whoop and begin an uproar, some throwing stones and dirt at the windows, eventually breaking the window. So the Justice Martin allegedly tried to pull Humphrey Smith out from the broken window, likely to allow the crowds to beat the living daylights out of Smith. So while in prison, Smith wrote, "There were diverse assaults made against us, both of the heathens and the rulers, who sought to vex us despitefully as they did. Some threw stones in the prison, the weight of 5 pounds, and threw dirt and water on my lodging, and spit on me, and pissed at me several times, and once they pissed on my food, but friends feared none of these things." This published fearlessness in the face of adversity was a testament to their very strong convictions. Smith and his co-religionists were forced to endure this level of abuse because they refused to show the judge hat honor during their trial. Yes, they were in this situation because they refused to remove their hats to the local authorities. Denying social superiors hat honor was provocative, and as I said, it's challenged social protocols. As with most of their actions, scripture could be used to illuminate and justify their position. Quakers do this all the time within this early period, probably until about the end of the 1660s. They are able to snap back with evidence from the Bible. It's a skill that they have, and fair play, they use it all the time. So the Quakers said that there was nothing in the Bible requiring one to remove one's hat in such circumstances. So it's not in the Bible, they're not doing it. At the sessions, the judge advised, "You might have had your liberty if you had not came in here in this contemptible way with your hat on. Therefore, you shall turn back again to the prison until you do come with your hat off." There were numerous suggestions that if prisoners would merely remove their hats, they would be released. To the authorities, removing one's hat was a pretty reasonable and straightforward request. With his refusal to comply with hat honor, Smith appeared to welcome abuse and imprisonment to drive forward his message. This 1655 case was an important precedent that demonstrated how local authorities could combat this threat to social order. Quakers also took advantage of the situation and used the case as written propaganda. Smith co-authored a publication addressed to Oliver Cromwell entitled A Representation of the Government of the Borough of Evesham, where he and his fellow prisoners detailed the abuse they had to endure. It was alleged that Smith had stones thrown at him, spit at him, threw man's dung in at him, and some more filthy abuses he had, which is a shame to name. One idle drunken man came in with a pike in his hand, swearing and railing with so much violence as though he would presently have murdered him. Cromwell responded to the publication after 5 months and delegated the investigation to James Barry, Major General of Herefordshire, Shropshire, and Wales, who issued a warrant for their release from jail on the 1st of September, 1656. Their release, on advisement of Cromwell, suggested another moment of toleration in Cromwellian rule. During the Protectorate, Oliver Cromwell was tolerant of religious groups, but the Quaker mass meetings, which were becoming more and more frequent in places, seemed likely to provoke public unrest. With this in mind, the Vagrancy Act was passed on the 17th of September, 1656. This is just 16 days after Smith and his fellow Quakers were released from Evesham jail. The intention of the Vagrancy Act was to prohibit traveling without cause, and this was used against the early Quaker missionaries. This was a precursor of legislation to come. Now, in 1656, George Fox had met with Oliver Cromwell. We're getting this idea that this was a time of great political and religious tension because Quakerism was rapidly growing and alarming many in authority. So this meeting took place in Whitehall, London. Fox was not invited by Cromwell, but wrote in his journal that he passed to Whitehall and found there a friend or two, and after some waiting, got to speak with Oliver Cromwell. It's a bit wild to think Cromwell actually granted Fox an audience. So this suggests that this suggests that Cromwell was curious to meet Fox. So Fox used this opportunity to explain Quaker beliefs and urged Cromwell to lay down his crown at the feet of Jesus and not become a typical ruler in worldly terms. He was also bold enough to warn Cromwell not to persecute God's people, meaning the Quakers, and he asked him to promote justice and righteousness. Even if Cromwell was sympathetic, the disruptive nature of the movement would continuously try his patience and further fuel the tension between Quakers and those in power. When we're talking about this early period of Quakerism and the Protectorate, we have to talk about James Naylor and the Bristol incident that occurred on the 24th of October, 1656. So, this incident, this story, is a fan favorite of most early Quaker historians, and it's definitely I had to really think about this, it's definitely in my top 3 in early Quaker history. It's got twists and turns and the worst character witness in history. I will be so bold as to say that. If you can think of worse, I really want to know and put it in the chat, please. This one's pretty bad. So this incident that's taking place here, it ticks 2 big boxes for us this evening. Why were Quakers perceived as dangerous? And how could authorities respond in a way that showed that they meant business? So, who is James Naylor? Well, he was born in 1618 in Ardsley near Wakefield, Yorkshire. He was a farmer's son with a modest education who served as a parliamentarian soldier in the civil wars under General Fairfax. He left the army in the mid 1640s, struggling with spiritual unrest. This becomes a theme sort of with the biographies of early Quakers, is that they have, before they come to Quakerism, they're all pretty much just a bag of spiritual misery. Like they're lost and just miserable. Anyway, so James Naylor leaves the army, goes back home, returns to Yorkshire, where he's back to being a farmer. He became a spiritual seeker, withdrawing from organized religion and spending a lot of time reading the Bible. He met George Fox in 1652 and was profoundly influenced by the Quaker message of the inward light. It resonated with him deeply. He quickly became one of the most gifted and charismatic Quaker ministers, preaching widely across England, drawing large crowds. He was known for his powerful voice, mystical intensity, and ability to inspire deep devotion. Now, this may be a bit cringe to say, but he was a bit of a rock star. That's sort of what it sounds like to me. And he was viewed by some followers as a near Christ-like figure, which would lead to controversy. By all accounts, Naylor was an extremely charismatic man and a great preacher. He attracted a loyal personal following, which troubled some other Quakers. Fox often expressed concern that Naylor was becoming over enthusiastic and erratic, and by 1656, Fox and Naylor were hardly on speaking terms. So, let's get to business. So, in October 1656, Naylor and his companions staged a demonstration that proved disastrous. They reenacted the arrival of Christ in Jerusalem on the streets of Bristol. Naylor rode in on horseback. Now, there are some, this story, it goes from being on, he's on horseback. Some contemporary reports say he was on a donkey. I think he was on a horse, but that's the wonderful thing about history. So, Naylor's rolling into town on horseback, attended by followers who sang, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God of Israel," and they strew the muddy path with garments. It's October, Bristol. It was probably raining. So it was probably very, very muddy. Anyway, now you may find this crazy, but he was arrested and charged with blasphemy. Though Naylor denied that he was impersonating Jesus and said rather that Christ was in him, he refused to explain his actions, and the ecstatic devotion of his followers convinced many that he thought he was the Messiah. The people he was with ended up they did a lot more damage than actual just this man riding into town on a horse. Now, this is a little side note that I find really interesting. When Naylor was arrested, he was carrying a copy of Epistle from Lentulus to the Roman Senate, and within its pages, it had a description of Jesus with his shoulder-length hair and short beard, which matched what Naylor was sporting. You can kind of see it in this image. So the case was tried in Parliament despite its lack of legal jurisdiction. Naylor's trial dominated the sessions, as you would expect it to. This was their opportunity to demonstrate real power against this looming threat of Quakerism. The trial itself, the testimony of some of his followers, was so deeply damaging to his case, and it was fully exploited to the full by those who wanted to use this incident to attack Quakers more generally. So Dorcas Erbry is sort of one of Naylor's lady followers. and the world's worst character witness. Like I said, unless you can think of a better one. Dorcas Erbery testified testified that Naylor was the only begotten Son of God, and she knew no other Jesus and no other Savior. He is on trial for blasphemy, please remember. She continued her testimony and claimed that Naylor had raised her from the dead. Her testimony was extremely unhelpful. So this incident encouraged challenges to the protectorate's policy of religious toleration. Naylor was used by the Puritan majority in Parliament as an example to justify increased persecution and suppression of the troublesome Quaker movement. Whereas Parliament wanted to undermine religious toleration for radical sects, Cromwell used the case to convince the army that he should have more effective control of Parliament. In the end, Parliament declared Naylor guilty of not just blasphemy, but horrid blasphemy, and said he was a grand impostor and great seducer of the people. This trial lasted 13 days. On December 16th, it was proposed that the punishment of James Naylor should be death. And the question being put, the noes went forth 96, the yeas 82, so it passed in the negative. On the next day, Wednesday the 17th of December, the House agreed to an amended sentence. His sentence was harsh. Naylor was sentenced to first be pilloried and whipped through the streets of London, then pilloried again, and then have his forehead branded with the letter B for blasphemer, and his tongue bored through with a hot iron. Afterwards, he was to be sent back to Bristol, taken through the city on horseback, bareback, with his face backwards, and publicly whipped, and then sent back to prison in Bridewell, London, and there restrained from the society of all people, and there to labor hard till he shall be released by Parliament, and during that time be debarred the use of pen, ink, and paper, and shall have no relief but what he earns by his daily labor. The first round saw Naylor so badly injured from 310 lashes that petitions were presented to postpone the second round. At his second pillorying, the three women grouped themselves around him in a way that evoked pictures of the three Marys at the cross. Gals, you are not helping here. If Naylor was used as an example by Parliament of the dangers of where unfettered religious toleration would lead, it might also be argued that he was made a scapegoat by a Quaker movement that was just beginning a significant yet slow process of transition. Many argue that the Naylor incident revealed critical organizational weakness in terms of corporate discernment and discipline for Quakers. This incident occurred at the start of a period of significant change for the Quaker movement, and it did serve to accelerate this transition. To the Quaker leadership, Naylor stood for everything they were trying to leave behind. And this incident validated the concerns and fears of their staunchest opponents. The impact of Bristol left a deep impression on Quakers, resulting in a growing concern for respectability and a fear of the chaos and ridicule brought by the uncontrolled spirit working within the individual. The late 1650s were a challenging period for Quakers as they had to cope with intense periods of persecution, as well as having to begin to self-censor members of their own community. The trouble did not stop with Naylor. It forced change, but the radical fringes of the movement were still preaching, still being arrested, and still being prosecuted. times were changing. The early leadership saw that they needed to evolve in order to survive. By 1660, Oliver Cromwell was dead. James Naylor was dead. Side note, James Naylor does not die in prison. He is released, and he is on his way home to visit his family in Yorkshire when he is robbed and beaten and left for dead, and then dies, I think a day or two later. But he dies very, very soon after. Um, so they're dead. However, there were around 50,000 Quakers living. And it can certainly be argued that the period of toleration they enjoyed with Oliver Cromwell in the interregnum ultimately enabled them to become the largest and most enduring of the revolutionary Civil War sects. They were simply too big to eradicate through persecution after the Restoration. Thank you.
Erica, thank you very much indeed for that. That was excellent. Thank you. And a
Thank
great
you.
summary. Um, uh, Folks, if you want to put questions into the chat, please feel free to do so. I know we've got a few people who've put in already out of that. Um, it's interesting in terms of you were talking about the sort of challenges, sort of, or that that a lot of people view this as a challenge to authority. Quite a few historians have sort of described Cromwell as being a religious radical, but a sort of a social and political conservative. Is that sort of one of the things that that I suppose is a paradox or a challenge to him in terms of his religious sort of viewpoints, where wanting to support them being able to worship in whatever they want, but obviously they're attacking his innate conservatism in other areas, as it
It
were.
it it really is the case, and I think that if oh, it's so dangerous to put our 21st century heads into these people, but you have to think that if you're Oliver Cromwell and you're giving them many, many inches, and they are taking many, many miles, and you've got it's like sort of as a historian of this period, I do find myself, especially sort of when you're reading through court cases and you're thinking, oh, this all really could have been avoided.
Mm,
And sort of one of the things, and I think, Quakers obviously believed that by standing up for their beliefs and sort of suffering the way that they did. Now, the really hardcore period of Quaker persecution comes after Oliver Cromwell. It comes after Richard as well. It really starts in the 1660s, where again there is this sort of in the Restoration, there's this little window of toleration that is quickly destroyed by Thomas Venner and Fifth Monarchists, and then sort of the Quakers are going to be sort of bearing the brunt of that for their own actions as well. But
mm.
it really becomes quite heavy-handed. But anyway, back to the 1650s where we want to be. Um, I do think that the Quakers I think that they really did challenge Cromwell. I think that if they had just, if they had sort of played the game and not been quite so disruptive, and obviously historians can disagree with me all as much as they'd like to about this. I do think that it could have been a much more harmonious
Mm.
relationship, but the Quakers were just, they were, they were just, they were moved, they were compelled by the Spirit. Again, sort of another thing that I don't really didn't really touch on in this is that with the whole period after the Civil Wars and all of the things that are taking place, like there is this genuine concern that their end times are coming.
Mm.
And they keep when Quakers are writing, and Quakers wrote voluminously, and they're this is a fear that they have, is that if people don't follow them, if they don't convert to Quakerism, they are going to be spending the rest of their days boiling in a lake of fire. And they write this quite frequently. The lake of fire comes up quite a lot. Um, so that's a very long-winded answer to a lovely question, Stuart. Thank you so much for kicking this off.
We're getting some lovely questions coming into the box just here, so I'll pop some of them in your direction. One from Simon here. Did any of the Quakers have a political agenda, or are they just seen as subversive, in inverted commas, by the authorities?
Well, I think that they really saw they wanted they I mean they wanted Cromwell to so they I guess they did have a political agenda because I think that they felt like Cromwell could have been an ally and should have been an ally. And so they are, they in this period, they are trying to use their influence as much as they can, to try and again, sort of obviously mainly to sort of save themselves. But they do see that, that they do see, like I said, that they see this potential ally in Cromwell, and the potential of, him sort of almost, it sounds crazy to say, but almost bending to their will.
Mm.
Um, and sort of bringing forth like this government that, like, like Fox had asked them, like not being a worldly leader, but being a spiritual leader.
It's
So
interesting you say about a lot of them going, with Fox and with Naylor, both of them going through this moment of crisis and a period of sort of not having a sort of sense of path or direction in life. And actually, that actually corresponds with Cromwell's personal journey as well. The fact that, his conversion in the 1630s, whilst he's living in St. Ives, to this sort of, he becomes a born again Puritan effectively. You think there is a sort of, a kind of a matching between the sort of two, as it were.
and when you look at it on paper, it doesn't seem like they're that different
Mm.
at first. And so that's another one of the really striking things I find about that relationship is their religious beliefs are are not totally counter to each other. Um, but obviously, Quakers sort of go one way
Yeah.
and Cromwell goes the other.
So a question from Nicola here. It says, Erica, having spent some research time with both Solomon Eccles and George Whitehead, she's really interested in your discussion of Quaker fearlessness. I wondered if you could talk a little more about where it came from, what impact it had on recruiting new members, and how much it contributed to the worries of the authorities, both under Cromwell and also under the Restoration as well, sort of, the Restoration government, how they sort of see this as a threat.
So just a little, just to sort of like Solomon Eccles is really, and George Whitehead, both very,
So
very.
you probably might need to explain a little bit for the wider audience who they were. So,
So they're coming into play a little bit later on. The sort of this is sort of beyond the 1650s, certainly. Solomon Eccles is an early Quaker who's essentially he's a violinist. And at one point, Quakers sort of, when they're sort of closing in the ranks, looking at discipline, Solomon Eccles in sort of, it's not even a protest moment, I don't think. You're sort of more than welcome to pipe in here. I'm not a Solomon Eccles expert, but he destroys all of his violins to sort of just say, hey, I am a Quaker now, and to hell with these violins. And it's one of those sort of like moments where it's like, wow, that is real passion. And so when it comes to sort of like that fearlessness, they're constantly writing. Quakers are like, so when James Naylor is not allowed to have pen, paper, or ink in prison, like this is a very big deal because Quakers are always writing from prison because a lot of them spend a lot of time there,
mm,
and they have access to these materials. And so they're writing these very passionate, sort of almost like I'm quite happy to be a martyr for this cause. I mean, it's very compelling stuff. The the Quaker printed material that's coming out at this period, it is very passionate. It is, and like I said, it's full of scripture. It's very sermon-like. They have to, when they're writing, when they're preaching, like they need to know their stuff. And they're putting out work at such a pace. And this is something I find the printing press at this period so fascinating because if you ever been in like with one of those printing presses and seen how they're set up, it's astounding when you think how small these booklets were and how many words they fit in them. And with the early Quakers, how many, like how prolifically they were publishing. It's quite astounding at the time. So the fearlessness, sort of going back to that, it's it's inspiring, right? To believe, and you can kind of sort of, when anybody believes in anything that much, um, that they're willing to endure grim 17th century prisons for it.
Mm.
You can see that that would be inspiring. Like, oh, they're willing to go through that. Let me go, and I'm going to go to this meeting next time they're in town and see what's up. Um, and then you're going to be met with these very impassioned preachers. And, when you sort of, again, they're not really talking, their ideas are, I mean, they don't, to us, they don't seem that radical, right? But at the time, having women, I think I saw a question popping up about women. I don't know. I didn't see I just saw women. And
Mm.
so at the time, women are able to preach. If they are compelled to be a Quaker minister, they can go and do it. And this is hugely radical at the time because women were, supposed to be in the kitchen. And so the fact that these women they're able to become traveling ministers. And we're talking about at the onset. This
Mm.
isn't sort of something that comes on at the end of the century. No, right at the get-go, women are allowed to go and become preachers. And, some Quaker men didn't like this. But George Fox, certainly in the 1670s, he's kind of saying to the Quaker community, he's like, y'all need to get on board because this is happening. Those are not his exact words. Don't quote me on that. But he is very, he loves the idea that there is equality. Sometimes this equality for women is only in name.
Mm.
Sometimes women ministers are going to be sort of they're going to have the more pastoral roles. They're going to be the ones who are like their responsibility within their, is to go and visit the prisoners. Their responsibility is to sort of mend the clothes, take care of the traveling ministers, things like that. So they, sort of their ministry isn't always just kind of like this, what we would think of as sexual equality. It's it can vary. It can vary. I
Yeah.
don't know if that was the question.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just
that
going
that
for
was
it.
that was a question. So that was a question from Beth. So about
Thanks,
the role of
Beth.
women in the Quaker movement. So that's great. That's answered that question. So John Davis has messaged me with one here, which is specifically about a case of a woman preacher by the name of Mary Fisher.
Oh,
Yeah, who John's asked about, what level of Quaker support do they supply to her? Because apparently she travelled all around England, went to Boston, eventually to the Ottoman Empire. I
she
mean,
did, and she had
what's that all about, and how did that come about? What
yeah,
was
and
that?
this is in the early period as well. So like,
Mm.
women ministers. Now, granted, so women who become ministers, they are traveling in pairs. Like the women are traveling together. So it's kind of, a little strength in numbers situation. But Mary Fisher is allowed to go, and she is bold and she is audacious enough to ask for an audience with the Sultan in in Constantinople, I think.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's extraordinary how she's able to do that, and she is supported. She is supported by Quakers. Um, sort of. There are also sort of women, very high, well, sort of notorious women preachers on the other side of Atlantic. So Mary Dyer in Boston is, there's a statue to her in Boston Common, not too far from where she was executed. And she was executed because essentially sort of like her English brethren, she was asked to get out of Boston. Don't come back, Mary, please. Don't hold any more meetings here. We're not interested. And she's just like, nah, I'm not going to heed that advice. I'm going to go back. She's arrested and she's eventually executed in Boston. And so these women are there. There are a lot of books sort of looking at women sort of women in the early Quaker movement, and they're absolutely fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Just sort of just the confidence, right? The confidence to go and just be like, you know what, I am going to ask for an audience there, or you know what, I am going to totally ignore you because I am compelled, and it's right for me to have this meeting in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and come what may, come what may.
We've got quite a question about sort of the relationship with sort of with America and the American colonies at the time. Sort of to what extent when are the Quakers going over there? Are they coming back? What is the sort of the crossover between the two sides of the Atlantic, as it were?
So Quakers start going over pretty early in the process and sort of setting up sort of obviously so when we get into sort of the few a bit later into the century, we've got William Penn sort
Mm.
of setting up sort of essentially the Quaker tract of land, which covers sort of most of metropolitan Philadelphia, northern Delaware, and that's very much sort of those there's a Quaker leg like Philadelphia is as William Penn territory, and same with Delaware as well, which is where I'm originally from. But that very early on they're going. But the interesting thing is that when you think about transatlantic travel in the 17th century, it's quite arduous. It's pretty awful. A lot of people die of disease. And so you would think that, okay, Quakers are going to go over and stay there. One trip is enough. No, George Fox goes back and forth quite a bit, going back and forth to the colonies, which I find exceptional. It's like to endure that trip once does not sound very nice, but to endure it several times is like, you know what, he believed in what he was selling very much.
We have a couple of questions here about the relationship between what the Quakers are famous for today and what they're famous for in the 17th century. So Colin
Is
asks
that
about
peace?
yeah.
Is that peace?
Colin asks about pacifism. So today that Quakers are famous for pacifism. Is that the case in the 17th century? And Ingrid asks about Quakers are associated with silence during their meetings. To what extent was that a sort of a feature of their worship in the 1650s? Are these practices that emerge later?
So peace comes around. So the Quaker peace testimony is in 1661, and this is very much in response to the fifth monarch, Thomas Venner, and the fifth monarchist revolt. Sort of after Charles II's coming back, there's this revolt, and then the eyes of the government are on all of these groups, and that's when sort of Quakers George Fox sort of crafts this statement essentially saying like we're about peace. We're not going to raise weapons against the monarch or the government. And so obviously that is something that it does happen very early on in the process. And it is such a lasting legacy of Quakerism and silences as well. Sort of Quaker meetings in silence. And so this again, it again starts it starts fairly early on. You sort of, the Quaker meeting houses, like Quaker once Quaker meeting houses are being built, and a lot of these Quaker meeting houses, they start being constructed in like the 1670s. That's kind of from that point onwards. We're at a point where we can like the first Quakers, the first converts in communities are starting to pass away. And a lot of these local communities are sort of they have the luxury of being led by more affluent members of their society. And so these people are able to leave in their wills land and building materials for their local for their local Quaker meeting houses to be built. And so these start popping up, and you sort of a big, and again, this remains to this day, right? There's no stained glass. There's no ornamentation. It's just a simple place. I mean, certainly in the north of England, there are some fantastic meeting houses from the 17th century, and you really get an idea of what it would have been like. Um, and so so there there's no distraction, right, in a Quaker meeting house. And you are, as I think as it is today, when you are compelled to speak, to minister, you do so. There would become sort of, as Quakers become more and more organized, there would become different meetings. So there would be organizational meetings on a county level, on an individual meeting level, and then we get sort of a national meeting in London. And so the organization sort of really starts coming into play. Certainly, I think, and it really starts in the 1670s when they're able to start sort of this is actually tying along with silence a little bit. In the 1670s, they realize that, okay, we've had a time. A lot of our first generation of Quakers are dead and died in prison. We still have some members who are publishing some work that is really putting us in disrepute. And so they set up a meeting that is essentially the Quaker editorial meeting. It's called the second day meeting. And so Quakers would, if they, for anything that they wanted published, it would have to go to the second day meeting. They would review it and say, okay, yes, this can be published. No, we're gonna have to ask for a rewrite on this one. And no, this will never see the light of day. But it is, sort of like that's a very loose tie-in to sort of silence, is that we do have, once we sort of they have to start self-censoring their members. So to answer your questions, peace started early and silence started early.
With the sort of
And remains to
tension.
this day.
Yeah, absolutely. With the sort of tensions, that sort of irritations or conflict that they seem to sort of engender, I wonder. I mean, based on a local example, obviously St Ives, where Cromwell lived away, has his conversion. We know in the 1650s there, All Saints Church, which is the parish church that he'd worshipped in, was very Puritan. The problem with the religious explosion then, there's one church, but there's four different religious groups using it. So there is, there's sort of those who are still clinging to the traditional Anglican version, but there's the Presbyterians, there's the Baptists and the Quakers. And they're all queuing up on Sunday, basically, and having a bun fight over who gets to worship in there first. And it's always the Quakers who seem to get beaten up. So, I mean, you wonder whether or not that there's an element of that too, in terms of competition, in terms of, particularly in those early days, they're all expecting to use their local parish church. And of course, there's one church between everybody. That must have
Yeah.
been, again, a cause of tension between these different religious groups.
Now that's really surprising because sort of within my research, sort of like the early Quakers in the sort of communities that I've researched, they're having their first meetings in people's homes.
Mm.
And then which obviously comes for the homeowner, comes at tremendous risk.
Yeah,
And so the idea that they are sort of, the idea that they're getting beaten up on a Sunday is wholly not surprising to me.
yeah.
They're just constantly, I mean, they are, there's this, it's like, are Quakers persecuted or are they prosecuted?
Mm.
And so that's sort of like an enduring question, right? Is like they are breaking the law. Are the local authorities being quite heavy-handed because they're tired of it? Or is the punishment fair for the repeated crimes?
Yeah.
It's kind of, it's it's tough. It depends. I think it probably it depends on who you ask. It really does depend on who you ask. Now, me, I think that Quakers tried the patience of everyone. I think that, one of my favorite Quaker stories is this Quaker, he ends up dying in prison, spoiler alert. But the judge gave him two opportunities to leave prison. And it was just like, Humphrey Smith, if you just leave, if you just go and just promise not to have any more meetings here, you can go home. Crack on, mate. And he was just like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm gonna stay here. Like he found those terms totally disagreeable. It's like, oh, come on.
Well, there's an impish question we've had asked here is that, bearing in mind this sort of behaviour, are basically the Quakers the sort of the Just Stop Oil protesters of
Oh,
the mid
yes.
17th
Oh,
century?
I love questions like this. I absolutely love questions like this. You know what? That's oh now oh I think yeah, I think if we're sort of looking at it with that lens on, I do think that there is a bit of Just Stop Oil about them. You wouldn't be surprised if they sort of were wearing orange hats.
Yeah.
Um
Turning up
so
and
so
throwing
yeah.
cans of soup all over the altar or whatever. Yeah,
Exactly. Oh, or just
yeah.
hurling spoiled milk at Richard Baxter.
Mhm.
Just yeah.
Yeah. And final question, one which is an obvious one to finish on from Andrea here. Fantastic talk, she says. She's learned loads, but what first got you interested in the Quakers?
Now this is I so I'm not a Quaker. I'm not a Quaker. It's one of the questions I'm always asked. Why Quakers? And are you a Quaker? No, I'm not. I'm not a Quaker. Just a big fan. So it really just Quaker history fell into my lap. So I did a master's dissertation on Tudor history, and I examined 37 analyzed, transcribed 37 wills from the Tudor period in a county in Wales. And so from that research and sort of going through all the information, I was absolutely fascinated by just the social history and the little tidbits about people that you could find there. And so when I was looking for a PhD topic, I was just kind of like, ooh, I definitely, want to continue, but what do I do? And so my who ended up being my supervisor, he is Quaker. He's a Welsh Quaker historian of Wales of this period. And he's like, well, have you ever thought about the Quakers? And I said, oh, no, that sounds super boring. I'll pass. And so he's like, no, just have a look because there's a great social history there. And so he's like, do a bit of reading, come back to me. Well, I read and I was like, whoa, these people were not what I was expecting. It's so they're so incredibly antisocial, I think. They just but sort of the research and the journey that I've been on with the Quakers, it has been the greatest gift of my life. I find new things out all the time. It's always fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Like the 17th century is a jam. Like, this is the place to hang out. You get invited to speak for cool, awesome museums. You get to learn so much about this very underrated, overlooked period of history. And with Quaker history, there's these great personalities that sort of burst through the pages, and there's so many biographies that have not been written about people. There's so many people who have just sort of lying in wait and just like, hey, write about me, cobble together my life. And yeah, and I absolutely love it. Thank you so much for that question because it is like Quaker history, 17th century Quaker history is pure joy for me. Love it.
I think we're kind of be salivating for your book on this. So it's due out in the autumn.
It is.
Yeah,
It is.
and it's
So
called Zealous.
yeah, oh, hang on. I've got a giant A3 poster. It's Zealous, A Darker Side of the Early Quakers, which is out on September 30th. Um,
Excellent.
and
Well,
so
we will.
it has been described. It had because I've gotten my sort of first endorsement today from a very eminent historian who said it was lively and authoritative. I'm like, oh, thanks. Thanks so
Oh,
much. So you've got that to look forward to.
we will absolutely be looking forward to that, and I'll be queuing up for a copy with it. So thank you so much, Erica. We'll do the proper silent round of applause in just a moment. Before we
Thank you
do,
all so much.
just to remind you, this is 3 out of 4 of our lecture series. The final lecture is next week. We've heard, as James Naylor referred to as the rock star of the Quaker movement. I think our final speaker is probably at the moment the rock star of 17th century historians, Jonathan Healy, next week. who's got also his new book coming out called The Blood in Winter, which is basically the slide to civil war. So basically those months in the autumn of 1641, going up to, of course, those awful events in January 1642, where the king tries to arrest the 5 MPs. Jonathan's new book, due out in a fortnight, tells that story, and we're one of the first places to get him to come and talk about it next week. So that's next week. Those of you who book season tickets will get all the details as usual. Those of you who haven't booked season tickets, then why not? And please book an individual ticket for next week. And otherwise, thank you so
Oh,
much, folks.
I've got one more thing to say. I've got one for the
Yes.
remaining audience. I've totally forgot. So I'm in the process of I'm a co-founder with Andrea Zuvich and Mark Turnbull of the first in-person live streamed Stuart History Festival, which is taking place in Worcester on the 5th and 6th of July. If you follow me on, if you could look for, if you just Google Stuart History Festival, you'll find it all over the place. We've got in-person talks. We've got Jonathan Healy as well, so gracing us on Sunday the 6th. And obviously, if you want to hear more about Quakers and sort of, we have talks covering the entire Stuart period. And yeah, sorry, I had to plug my
Not,
own
not at
voice.
all. Plugs welcome. So
Yeah.
yeah, no. Well, look, please do look online, and you'll find the details undoubtedly through all of those the websites, and look online. I think there's a Facebook page for it, Andrea, and so on, isn't there? So yeah, do have a look online for that as well. So if you're over in Worcester or to follow online, then please do support our friends over there with that. But otherwise, just remains for me to say, please give the usual silent round of applause. And thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening, folks.
Thank you.